So having looked at what absolutism is, I want to give you some examples of what absolutism looked like in practice. So you'll see some common characteristics with absolute rulers. This isn't really a comprehensive list, but just a few examples of things that absolute rulers tended to do. One thing you often see they do is they strengthen their political and economic power. This is the power of both the individual monarch as well as their state. You'll see absolute monarchs build up the military and use it to achieve political means. You'll see them try to control the nobility and any assemblies, parliaments, or states general, or other things like that. Need control the nobility because that's another group that has power and might have interests different from the monarch. You'll see absolute monarchs try to control religion within their realms. And you'll often see them build physical monuments to their power. Castles, palaces, whole cities, just as sort of examples of how great the monarch is. So I want to run through a few examples, and again, this isn't a comprehensive list, but just sort of a few sort of archetype absolutists. So one of the earlier absolute monarchs was King Philip II of Spain. Philip was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the same one that had prosecuted Martin Luther. And he's ruling Spain during this time of colonization. So to help strengthen the economy, he's bringing in literally tons and tons of gold and silver from the New World. And that's helping him build up the Spanish economy, although for reasons we'll see, not as well as maybe he could have. He considered himself an extremely Catholic monarch, both personally and politically. So you often see within his realm, he enforced Catholicism. He drove Jews and Moors, or North African Muslims, out of Spain, and actually sort of consolidated power in the Spanish Catholic Church so that he had influence over who bishops were, and started his own inquisition or church courts to go after any heretics. He also used his military to go to war against both Protestant states and Muslims. So in the Mediterranean, he's fighting the Ottoman Empire. Remember, he was married to Mary I, Queen of England. He tried to force Elizabeth to marry her so he could force England back into Catholicism. And when she refused, he tried to send an armada, a fleet, to attack England. He built a palace called El Escorial. Escorial is interesting because it is both part palace but also part monastery, as well as a fortress. So it sort of shows these characteristics of Philip, both his political power and his military might and his religion. The one problem that Philip had in trying to consolidate his power is he didn't effectively control the nobility in Spain. Spanish nobility had always sort of been very regional in their power, and he wasn't able to overcome that. Additionally, even though he's bringing in all this gold and silver, the tax system of Spain was very inefficient. So as much silver and gold they're bringing in, they didn't actually raise tax rates to match the rate of inflation. So within Philip's lifetime and reign, inflation in Spain really skyrocketed and pretty much ruined the Spanish economy. But he's one of the earlier examples of these rulers that really tries to concentrate all the power in himself. He didn't share it with anybody. He even considered himself, not to listen to his advisors because he would make all the decisions. Probably the most famous and maybe strongest absolute monarch we see is Louis XIV of France. He became king at a very young age as a child, and during his youth there was a noble revolt. So his advisor, a cardinal by the name of Mazarin, really tried to tell Louis that his job was to rule France and God had given him that job. So really enforce this divine rule idea. Maybe the most famous thing that Louis did as monarch was build this palace of Versailles. Versailles was not in Paris itself where the nobles lived, but instead outside of it. And he turned Versailles into this huge palace filled with rooms and gold and acres of gardens. The point was partly to show his power and wealth, but also he started to require the nobles to move to Versailles. Nobles who didn't live in Versailles with him, if they wrote him asking for advice or asking for favors, he would say, "Oh, we never hear from them." And in Versailles, you had this sort of courtly life where everything was very structured. When Louis woke up in the morning, certain chosen nobles would be there to help him put on his shoes and get his morning shave and help him with breakfast. The idea was that it centered everything around Louis and himself. He further weakened the nobles by sort of cutting them out of their job. Remember, the job of nobles originally was to collect taxes and rule in the name of the king. He made those nobles move to Versailles and created a state group of bureaucrats called the intendants to gather taxes for him. He also wanted to modernize France's economy. He had a well-known finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and he innovated a lot of the mercantilist practices and expanded France's colonial power. And famously, Louis supposedly said when his nobles or his advisors tried to make decisions without him, they saying it was state matters, he said, in French, l'état c'est moi, which means I am the state, essentially saying that Louis himself was the government of France. And also to show that he frequently went to war with his neighbors. Often he lost these wars, but the point of the wars he thought was to glorify not only France, but also through him, France. He went to war in Spain to put a member of his dynasty, the Bourbons, on the throne, which he successfully did, although the war almost bankrupted France. He was also pretty religious. He saw himself, again, as chosen by God, and as a Catholic monarch, he wanted to consolidate his power. His grandfather had put into place this law called the Edict of Nantes, which allowed the Huguenots, which you remember, the French Protestants or Calvinists, to live in relative peace in France. They had some restricted rights, but they were allowed to be there. Louis famously revoked that edict, basically telling the Huguenots that they had to either convert or get out. And if they didn't convert, he sort of harassed them by having these military forces essentially live in their houses until the Huguenot nobility left. So Louis is kind of really well known as greatly consolidating French power into the hands of the monarch itself. There's a few pictures of Versailles. It's a huge palace. And like we said, all the nobles had to live here if they wanted to really see anything they want to get done. And so this is really emblematic of Louis's reign. Another absolutist monarch from a country we haven't talked much about so far was Peter the Great of Russia. Russia for centuries had been under Mongol rule, so they had missed sort of the development in the rest of Europe. So when Peter becomes Tsar of Russia, Russia's really sort of behind the times. So from a young age, he was interested in trying to modernize Russia, or as we might say, westernize, because he was trying to make it more like Western Europe. He spent a lot of time in Western Europe. He hired Western European advisors, and this helped him modernize Russia. That's really the key thing, is he fixed the tax system, tried to reform it so that all the power wasn't in the hands of the nobles, who were called the boyars, the landowning class, and tried to make Russia really look like other European states. He studied extensively Western European militaries and modeled his military off after the ones that he saw. So he made his navy look like the Dutch and English navy. He made the army look like the Prussian army, trying to make it look like a modern Western state. And he used that army to try and achieve his means. One problem he saw is that Russia did not have a warm water port. Most of Russian waters were frozen in the winter. So he went to war against Sweden for a small patch of land on the Baltic Sea. And once he grabbed that land, he built on it a new capital called St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was modeled after other modern European cities like Amsterdam. And so that too became sort of an emblem of Peter's rule. The Orthodox Church has always been very influential in Russia, and its patriarch, its leader, kind of like the Pope in Catholicism, but not, had a lot of power, and often power over the czars. So to show the power that he had, Peter actually eliminated the position of patriarch. He put the Orthodox Church in Russia under state control. He made a group called the its name escapes me at the moment. Anyway, he put the church under state control. So again, you've got a control of religion there. There are other ones we could get into, just to touch on a couple other absolutists. In Austria, you had the Habsburg dynasty. This is the same dynasty that we talked about previously with Charles the Fifth, the Holy Roman Emperor, except after Charles, it splits between the Spanish Habsburgs, like Philip, and then the Austrian Habsburgs. The Austrian Habsburgs had to deal with a very large, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. And to do that, they sometimes would create nobility. When the Bohemians protested their being forced into Catholicism, the Austrian emperor, or the Habsburg emperor, went to them and convinced them, look, I'll make you nobility if you stay loyal to me. And so in that way he's able to control the nobility. He also made sure his daughter, Maria Theresa, succeeded the throne, which was unusual because she was a woman. But she proved to be a very able empress. She had many, many children, and to consolidate her power, she married those children often to other noble families. A rival state to Austria was Prussia. Prussia was initially actually not a kingdom, but a duchy. So just a duke was in charge of that. But through a series of political maneuvers, making alliances, often temporarily, with their rivals like the Habsburgs, they were able to turn themselves from a duchy to a kingdom. And then over generations, they expanded their territory. Prussia was sometimes called an army with a state because the Prussian military was modernized under an emperor named Frederick. And he essentially had this massive, well-trained army that Prussia could use to achieve its political goals. Probably the best-known absolutist monarch in Prussia was Frederick the Great. He was really very modern in his thinking of statehood. He wanted the religion to be separate from the state, so there was no state religion in Prussia. That was actually advantageous because it attracted not just Catholics or Protestants, but whatever religion people wanted to follow. So, for example, when Louis kicked those Huguenots out of France, a lot of them went to Prussia and helped the economy there. So as you look at these absolute monarchs, I want you to kind of think about how they match those ideas